Okay, so hi everyone. My talk today is about grape Phylloxera, which is the tiny insect pest that destroys grapevines by feeding on their roots. So Phylloxera, as you can see here, is an aphid with a very complex life cycle. But in its wingless form, it lives underground in the soil and feeds on the sap from grapevines and eventually kills the vines. So it's extremely destructive and globally is considered a very serious threat to viticulture. So anyone that's familiar with the history of the global wine industry will be aware of how damaging the insect can be and has been historically. From the mid-19th century onwards, it laid waste to vast swathes of vineyards, starting in southern France in the Rhone Valley and expanding outwards. It was discovered that the only real way to stop a Phylloxera infestation was actually to uproot vineyards altogether and replant them with Vitis vinifera vines grafted onto rootstocks from North American vine species. This is because Phylloxera originated in North America before being unwittingly transported to Europe. So American vines possess a natural resistance that enables them to heal when the Phylloxera lice feed on them. The upshot of all of this is that across the world, wherever Phylloxera has been detected, growers have had to grub up their vineyards and replant them on grafted rootstock. In 1877, Phylloxera was detected for the first time in Australia, and that was near Geelong in Victoria, and it fairly quickly spread across other parts of Victoria, New South Wales to Queensland and also New Zealand. But to date, it's never been detected in South Australia or WA or Tasmania for that matter. So South Australia's Phylloxera-free status is to a large extent thanks to legislative moves around what we would now call biosecurity on the part of the colonial government of the late 19th century. Prompted by a delegation of concerned vignerons led by Thomas Hardy of McLaren Vale, stringent quarantine measures were put in place and a Phylloxera board was set up, funded by levies from grape growers and with broad-ranging powers to destroy vineyards, set up exclusion zones and compensate affected growers in the event of any outbreaks. I'm an anthropologist, not a biologist or a soil scientist, so I feel a little bit out of place at this conference, but what I'm interested in most here is the social and cultural dimensions of Phylloxera. In other words, how do people think about the insect? How do they respond to its threat? And what does all of this mean for collective identity in a wine-growing region or even in a state like South Australia? Why is it that Phylloxera remains such an imposing figure in South Australia's viticultural imagination? Why do vignerons still shudder when they hear the name of Phylloxera? So I've got here, just as a little indication, this is the model of the Phylloxera louse that you can see at the National Wine Centre, and it looks menacing and horrible and big and yellow. First of all, in a physical sense, South Australia's grapevines are quite unique globally. A lot of the industry promotion about SA's Phylloxera-free status hinges on the fact that what it means is that here in South Australia we still have all of these old vines on their own roots, which in many cases actually predate the outbreaks of Phylloxera in Europe, which prompted mass replanting of vineyards. So many of the oldest productive vines in the world are actually right here within an hour or two's drive from Adelaide, and a Phylloxera outbreak would put these vines in danger. However, the jury is out on what old vines and own-rooted vines actually mean in terms of wine quality. A lot of growers will tell you that depending on the rootstocks used, grafted vines will perform differently in different growing conditions, crop differently and so on, but that's not necessarily an indicator of quality. But certainly some of the old vines that predate Phylloxera still crop well and make quite complex and high quality wines. But the real value of these vines is actually, I would say, in their symbolic value that's associated with their rarity and their history and heritage and so on. So some of the vines stretching right back to the earliest days of European colonisation. So South Australia's phylloxera-free status has provided a central theme for the imagining of a particular kind of viticultural identity around these vines. Here we remain, or so we are told, clean, green and phylloxera-free. So that's a powerful thing. Having dodged phylloxera, South Australian regions think of themselves as being pure in a way that those east of the border, for example, are not. This paper is based on my PhD research in McLaren Vale, where I was looking at how people construct a sense of regional identity through grape growing and winemaking. And McLaren Vale's quite interesting because possibly more than any other South Australian region, it kind of thrives on and promotes things like its environmental credentials, its apparent, progressiveness and innovation when it comes to things like vineyard irrigation, sustainable vineyard practices, organic viticulture and so on. But at the time of my main fieldwork in 2012-2013, phylloxera was starting to come into renewed focus in the Vale. So even though South Australia is still phylloxera-free, for the sort of previous decade or so, it had been on the move again in Victoria, popping up in places that had previously successfully eradicated it, or so they believed. And more worryingly, it was popping up in new spots altogether. So in McLaren Vale, local anxieties were growing about the ability of the phylloxera board at the time to fulfil its functions. Specifically, a lot of the growers and winemakers that I interviewed were concerned about moves by the board to relax quarantine and sanitation regulations and requirements around the movement of vine and grape material and vineyard machinery between regions. And this is because phylloxera can lay dormant in the soil for a long time, so it can easily be transported unwittingly through machinery, harvesters and boots and so on that have been improperly sanitised. The loosening of regulations was related, at least in the minds of Vale wine growers, to the dominant presence on the phylloxera board of large winery corporations that source their grapes from across multiple regions. So because of their scale, the scale of their operations, these sorts of companies have a financial interest in cutting red tape and facilitating the easy transport of material and machinery. So for them, these benefits associated with relaxing regulation outweighed the potential increased risk of phylloxera outbreaks. But for small-scale growers in the Vale, a phylloxera outbreak in a region like theirs would be devastating. So currently, McLaren Vale has only about 20% of its vines planted on resistant rootstocks. The huge costs involved with replanting, mass replanting, would force some growers to walk away. Costs 5 times as much to plant on resistant rootstocks than on own-rooted rootlings. And so you'd see a fundamental restructuring of the economic and social relations in the region, as has been the case everywhere else that phylloxera has struck. So in this, the interests of different types of grape growers and wine producers that operate at different scales can often be diametrically opposed when it comes to their reactions to phylloxera risk. And this sort of thing led to all sorts of outbursts of community anger, recrimination, allegations of kind of conflicts of interest on the board, and so on, when it came to the machinations of the phylloxera board. So I don't want to dwell too much on this here. Suffice it to say that even in its absence, the ongoing threat of Phylloxera and its presence across the border still maintains a great hold over the imagination of a lot of wine growers in South Australia. So what I want to emphasise is that Phylloxera's position in the viticultural imaginary, what I'm calling the viticultural imaginary of South Australia, is not only that of a biological threat or even an economic threat, but it's a symbolic threat to a sense of wine-growing purity that's exemplified, for example, in things like the old vines in the Barossa Valley and McLaren Vale and so on. So, of course, there's a range of other damaging grapevine diseases and pests from which South Australia has not been spared. And with large segments of the industry reliant on things like intensive chemical fungicides and pesticides and so on, while draining aquifers and the river for irrigation, purity might seem like something of a tall claim. But the position of Phylloxera in South Australia is also historically informed by attitudes to the bug elsewhere in the world. Because of its insidiousness, invisibility and destructiveness, Phylloxera has always been aligned kind of metaphorically with chaos and disorder and pollution and these sorts of concepts. And in Europe, it carried with it associations of impurity, national impurity and social impurity. So in northern France, for example, in the Champagne region, it was seen as a manifestation of southern degeneracy. In Germany, national borders were secured against the pest that was symbolic of French corruption. And some commentators even put the spread of Phylloxera down to a turning away from God. So in this sense, it's not just a pest, but pestilence. And even the remedy for Phylloxera was problematic. In Europe, people were initially up in arms against the idea that their local vines could be grafted onto American roots, because vines are such powerful symbols of local and regional and national identity. The idea of vines having to be hybridised and losing their integrity was deeply distasteful to some, but the reality of Phylloxera necessitated it. And grafting vines became normalised in Europe, and so all of the famous wine regions there and most of the rest of the world are now planted on grafted vines. And so this was also the case in South Australia, that Phylloxera had moral aspects to it. And here there were news articles linking Phylloxera infestations in Victoria, for example, to a viticultural laxity that stemmed from a deficiency of character. So like in Europe, Phylloxera was a pestilence that was visited on the wicked and the negligent. And needless to say, this fit very snugly with South Australian views of Victoria at the time as a crime-ridden den of gold-obsessed chances, troublemakers, bushrangers and convicts. So these associations of Phylloxera with impurity in a moral sense persist. And when it came to the recent uproar about the Phylloxera board, for example, the argument was as much about the insidious influence of corporate capitalism on decision-making as it was about actual biosecurity policy and practice. So in this view, Phylloxera is not just spread by soil, machinery and other vectors, but facilitated by corporate greed and a lack of moral fortitude among decision-makers. I'll probably skip to the end because I'm out of time. But what I want to say, just to summarise, is that while we're assessing threats to biosecurity, like Phylloxera, for example, or other elements associated with agricultural sustainability, it's important to pay attention to the social and cultural values that people attach to processes and practices and places. And that way we'll be better informed in terms of their meanings for individuals and communities and better able to engage with and find solutions to them. Thank you.